Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be back.
Today we're tackling a pretty big question.
Oh, yeah.
Is democracy in crisis? And to help us unpack that,
Yeah.
we're going to be looking at a fascinating podcast called Democracy in Question.
Okay.
It's hosted by Shalini Randeria, who heads up this Central European University.
I see.
And she's been talking to all kinds of experts about elections around the world
Interesting.
and what they tell us about the state of democracy today.
Okay.
So we're going to try to pull out the key takeaways,
That's a good.
kind of synthesize all these different perspectives for you, give you a sense of the big picture,
I like it.
and hopefully give you some food for thought.
A little brain food.
Right. Excellent. So
Yeah.
where should we begin?
Well, I think it makes sense to start with Europe.
Okay, Europe.
Yeah.
I have to admit,
Yeah.
some of the trends there are a little concerning.
Oh, yeah. What do you have in mind?
Well, the rise of far-right parties in places like Austria and Germany.
Right.
What's going on over there?
Well, one of the experts, Renderia, spoke with Johanna Lutz.
Okay.
She argues that it's all tied to this surge in identity politics.
Identity politics.
Yeah, and polarization.
Okay.
These parties are really good at tapping into anxieties
Anxieties about...
about national identity,
Okay.
cultural shifts, things like that.
Right, so they're playing on people's fears.
Exactly. They offer this kind of simplistic us versus them narrative, and it seems to be resonating with a lot of voters.
And you even have leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary
Right.
who are openly embracing this idea of illiberal democracy.
Yes, illiberal democracy. That's the term he uses.
So what does that even mean?
Well, basically, it's a system where you still have elections,
Okay.
but things like individual rights and the rule of law, they take a backseat.
So it looks like a democracy on the surface.
Right.
But underneath, it's something else entirely.
Yeah. It's like democracy with an asterisk.
And it's not just talk, right?
No, not at all.
I mean, Austria's recent election, a far-right party actually won.
They did. And according to political scientist Raymond Lowe,
Okay.
this isn't just some isolated incident.
Right.
He sees Austria as a symptom of this larger shift
A shift to the
to the right.
to the right. That's it.
Yeah, this rightward shift that's happening across the EU.
So traditional parties are losing their grip.
They are.
Yeah.
And these far-right groups are filling the void.
It's this idea that extremism is becoming normalized.
That's what's so worrying.
It's unsettling for sure.
Yeah, and there's this one expert, Julia Ebner.
Okay.
She actually spent time embedded with different extremist groups.
Wow.
Yeah, talk about dedication to understanding the problem.
Wow.
And her work is really eye-opening.
So what did she find out?
One thing she discovered is that these groups are masters of using the internet
The internet, of course.
to recruit and spread their message. They're really good at targeting specific demographics online.
Like who?
Well, young people, for example, they'll infiltrate online gaming communities.
Really?
Yeah, knowing that they're more susceptible to this kind of rhetoric.
So it's like a virus.
Exactly. It spreads quickly and it can be really difficult to contain.
And speaking of things spreading,
Yeah.
Seema Sieta, who studies Islamophobia, argues that it's become more than just prejudice.
Right.
It's morphed into this kind of structural racism
Structural racism.
that's used for political gain.
How so?
Well, she highlights how certain politicians in media outlets,
Okay.
they intentionally amplify fears about Muslims,
To what end?
well, to distract from other issues
I see.
or to consolidate their own power.
The old divide and conquer tactic.
Exactly. And it seems to be working.
Working. How?
Well, Ivan Krastev, who analyzes European elections, he suggests that the political center is genuinely crumbling.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty alarming.
It sounds like all these pieces fit together.
They do.
The rise of the far right, the normalization of extreme views,
Right.
the weaponization of Islamophobia.
It paints a pretty bleak picture for Europe.
It does raise the question,
What's that?
is Europe a canary in the coal mine for democracy?
That is a good question. So what's happening outside of Europe? Are we seeing similar patterns
Well,
in other parts of the world?
it's not just limited to Europe.
Oh,
Populism is a global phenomenon.
populism.
Yeah, and Catherine Fieschi,
Okay.
she's an expert on the topic.
Well,
And she argues that it's not just some passing trend.
okay.
It's fundamentally reshaping the political landscape.
Really?
And what's interesting is that it's not just happening in countries with weak democratic traditions.
So you're saying
It's popping up in established democracies too.
so why now?
Right. Why this global surge in populism?
What's fueling it?
Well, Fieschi points to a couple of big factors.
Okay, let's hear them.
One is that people are increasingly disillusioned.
Disillusioned
with traditional political institutions.
Okay.
They feel like the system isn't working for them anymore.
I could definitely see that.
Yeah, it's like the same old problems never get solved.
Right.
And people are just fed up.
So what's the other factor?
The second big factor is the rise of digital media.
The internet.
Exactly. It's given populist leaders this incredibly powerful platform to bypass traditional media.
So they can just go directly to the voters.
Precisely. And they often spread messages that, let's just say, not entirely accurate.
Right. So populism is this global wave.
It is.
But how's it playing out in specific places?
Good question.
Let's take India, for example.
Okay, India.
They just had their elections.
They did.
What's the story there?
Well, Yogendra Yadav, he's a political scientist who focuses on India. And he points out this really interesting link between the economy and how people vote.
What's the link?
He says there's this growing expectation in India.
An expectation?
That democracy should lead to tangible economic improvements.
Improvements in there.
In their lives.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But when that doesn't happen, people start to look for alternatives.
Right.
And populist leaders who offer quick fixes.
Right.
They become much more appealing.
So it's not just about abstract ideas of democracy.
No.
It's about whether it delivers the goods.
It's about results.
Exactly.
Okay.
What about the UK?
The UK.
They've had quite the political roller coaster ride.
They have.
In the past few years.
Yeah. Brexit, the pandemic.
Right.
It's been a lot.
So what's the latest?
Well, Mark Leonard.
Yeah.
He's a British commentator, and he thinks there might be a return to centrism in the UK.
A return to centrism. Interesting.
Yeah, he argues that there's this growing fatigue with all the divisiveness of the far left and the far right.
So they're craving stability after all the chaos.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
And he also mentions that the UK is going through some major socio-economic shifts,
like
growing inequality.
Cultural fragmentation. These things could be feeding into the desire for a more balanced approach.
Okay. But will it last?
That's the million-dollar question.
Only time will tell. Now let's shift gears.
Okay.
And head to South Africa.
South Africa.
They have such a unique story to tell.
They do.
Given their history of apartheid.
Right.
And the transition to democracy.
Yeah. What did you learn from their recent elections?
Well, Adam Habib,
an
academic and activist, provided a really insightful look at the South African landscape.
What did he say?
Well, he talked about the African National Congress.
The ANC.
The party that spearheaded the fight against apartheid.
Right.
And he talked about their complex legacy.
How so?
Well, he highlighted that the struggle to tackle inequality, which is deeply ingrained in South African society, is far from over.
So even though apartheid officially ended decades ago, its effects are still being felt today.
And Habib also emphasized the vital role of activism.
In keeping the government accountable.
Okay.
And pushing for social justice.
So people are still fighting for change.
They are. He specifically mentioned the Fees Must Fall protests.
Oh, yeah, the student protest.
Right, where students were demanding affordable higher education.
Those were powerful protests.
They were.
Yeah.
It shows how people are using their voices to fight for change.
To challenge the status quo.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it brings us to a crucial point.
Okay.
All these events we've talked about.
Yeah.
The rise of the far right in Europe. The student protests in South Africa.
Yeah.
They're all interconnected.
Interesting. How
they're reflections of these larger global trends.
I see.
That are shaping the future of democracy.
So we can't view these events in isolation.
No.
They're all part of this bigger, more intricate global tapestry.
Exactly. And that's why we're doing this deep dive.
Makes sense.
We're trying to make sense of it all.
Okay.
To see the patterns and understand what it means for the future of democracy. And that's a conversation we should definitely continue.
We should. What are the implications of all these trends?
Right.
What does it all mean?
We'll unpack those questions in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. It seems like what we're seeing is a global crisis of confidence.
In democracy.
Yeah. People are disillusioned with the way things are.
Okay.
Frustrated by economic disparities and apprehensive about all this rapid social and cultural change.
Right. It feels like the world is in a constant state of flux.
Yeah, it is.
And everyone's just struggling to adapt.
Yeah. And in that kind of environment, it's easy to see how simple answers and scapegoats would start to sound really appealing.
Even if they're not realistic.
Exactly. And that's where populist leaders come in.
Okay, so they're capitalizing on.
They capitalize on those anxieties, and they offer these simplistic solutions.
To complex problems.
Exactly. And they often use divisive rhetoric and tactics.
To gain power. To rise to power.
And it seems like technology is making this trend even worse.
Oh, absolutely.
Social media, it's a double-edged sword.
It is.
On the one hand, it can be a great tool for connecting people.
Right.
But it's also a breeding ground for misinformation.
Misinformation and propaganda.
It's made it so difficult to separate fact from fiction.
It has. And that constant bombardment of distorted information, it creates this climate of distrust, cynicism.
And it undermines faith in democratic institutions.
Exactly.
Like we're drowning in information.
We are.
But we're parched for truth.
That's a great way to put it. So where do we go from here?
Right. Is there any hope for democracy?
I believe there is. But it requires a collective effort. From all of us.
Okay, so citizens,
politicians,
civil society organizations,
the media, everyone has a role to play.
In safeguarding democracy.
In safeguarding and strengthening democratic values.
And institutions.
Yes.
Okay, that sounds good in theory.
Yeah.
But what does that look like in practice?
What can we as individuals actually do?
To make a difference.
Right, well, for starters.
Yeah.
We need to become more discerning consumers of information.
Okay, so we can't just passively absorb everything we see online.
No, we need to check sources.
Verify facts.
Be wary of emotionally manipulative language.
And sensationalized headlines.
Exactly.
So we need to sharpen our BS detectors.
We do.
And be more intentional about where we get our information.
Absolutely.
Okay, what else?
We also need to engage in meaningful dialogue.
Dialogue
with people who hold different perspectives.
It's easy to stay in our echo chambers.
It is.
And just demonize anyone who disagrees with us.
Right, but that just deepens polarization.
And it makes it impossible to find common ground.
Exactly. So it's about understanding where someone else is coming from.
Even if we don't agree with them.
Even if we don't agree with them. Maybe finding that little bit of common ground.
That's shared value.
That can be the starting point for a more productive conversation.
Okay, I like that. What else can we do?
Well, another crucial step is supporting organizations that are actively working to promote democracy and human rights.
Okay, so donating our time.
Your money, your voice.
Anything we can do to help these organizations thrive.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
And of course, participating in the democratic process.
That's essential.
Voting in elections.
Voting, engaging with your elected officials.
Making your voice heard.
Getting involved in your community.
So don't just sit on the sidelines and complain.
Right. Get in the game.
Be part of the solution.
Democracy isn't a spectator sport.
I like that.
It demands active and engaged citizens.
So this is a call to action.
It is.
A reminder that democracy is fragile.
It is.
And requires constant vigilance.
And nurturing.
The stakes are high.
They are incredibly high. The future of democracy hangs in the balance.
That's a sobering thought.
It is.
But it's also empowering.
How so?
Because we have the power to shape the future.
We do. Even small actions can have a ripple effect.
So don't give in to despair.
Don't give in to apathy.
Use this knowledge.
Use these insights.
To become more informed and engaged citizens.
Because as we've seen today, democracy isn't something we can take for granted.
It's something we have to fight for.
And protect.
And there are resources out there to help us navigate these complex issues.
There are Shalini Randaria's podcast, Democracy in Question.
It's a great place to start.
It is. It's packed with insights.
From leading thinkers.
And experts from around the world.
It's a good reminder that we're not alone in this journey.
We're not.
People all over the world are grappling with these challenges.
And they're working towards solutions.
So before you check out that podcast.
Yes.
Let's wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
With a final thought-provoking question for our listeners. We've been talking about a lot of pretty heavy stuff.
We have the erosion of trust, the rise of populism, the spread of misinformation.
It paints a pretty complex picture of democracy around the world.
It does.
So the question I want to leave you with is this.
Okay.
Given everything we talked about, how can we each engage in meaningful ways to actually strengthen democratic values and institutions?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. It feels like so much of what we've discussed is so large scale,
Right.
so systemic.
Yeah.
I mean, besides voting and staying informed, which are both super important,
Of course.
what can the average person actually do
Well,
to make a difference?
one really impactful way to engage is by supporting and participating in civil society organizations.
Okay. Civil society organizations.
Yeah, find groups that are working on issues that you care about.
Okay.
Whether it's protecting the environment, advocating for social justice,
Right.
promoting civic education.
To find your cause,
Yeah.
find your people, join the movement.
Exactly. These organizations are on the front lines.
Okay.
They're holding power accountable. They're giving a voice to marginalized communities. And they're championing those essential democratic principles.
Oh, okay. So that's one way.
Yeah. And don't underestimate the power
The power of...
of just having conversations about these issues with people in your life.
Oh, interesting.
Share what you're learning, respectfully challenge assumptions,
Right.
encourage critical thinking.
So those individual connections can make a difference.
They can. It's about those ripples that can eventually create a wave of change.
I like that. It's like we're all part of this giant web,
We are.
and even the smallest actions
Yeah.
can send vibrations throughout the whole system.
It's true, and it can feel overwhelming to think about fixing everything,
It can,
but maybe focusing on what we can control.
in our own little spheres of influence.
Exactly. That's a good place to start.
And change doesn't happen overnight,
Right? It rarely does. It's a long game.
requiring patience and persistence.
And a deep-seated belief in the power of collective action.
So don't get discouraged.
Don't give up.
If you don't see results immediately,
Keep learning.
keep pushing for progress.
And never lose sight of the fact that a better future is possible.
If we work together to build it.
Well said. And if you're looking for inspiration along the way,
Yeah.
I highly recommend checking out Shalini Randaria's podcast.
Democracy in question.
Democracy in Question. It's a treasure trove of insights
From all those leading thinkers,
and practitioners from around the world.
it's a great reminder that we're not alone in this.
We're not. People all over the world are grappling with these same challenges.
And they're working towards solutions.
They are.
So by connecting, learning from each other, and supporting each other's efforts,
We can create a more just and democratic future for everyone.
what a great note to end on.
It is. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Into the state of democracy around the globe.
It's been a pleasure.
And a huge thank you to you, dear listener,
Yes, thank you for listening.
for being part of this conversation.
We appreciate you.
Until next time, keep questioning
Keep learning.
and keep striving to make a positive impact.
We're all in this together.
We are.